Welcome back to my NFL 2022 Exit Report series. It is February 11th, first of three that I'm going to be recapping today, and it starts with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Always entertaining, always a tough team to plot against, really, because Mike Tomlin, they always have that team ready to go. They were in a transition year, that's for sure, between 2021 and 2022, the end of the Big Ben era. The late playoff push was exciting at the end of last year. They snuck into the playoffs. They didn't go far in the playoffs, but they had a lot of peak performances last year. Think back, TJ Watt, 22 and a half sacks. The team had 54 sacks. Minka Fitzpatrick, 124 total tackles, not only 2021, but obviously last year as well. He's just a playmaker. I don't know why you throw in his direction on critical downs because he just has a nose for the ball. Takeaways are part of his game. So what did we think coming into 2022 with the Pittsburgh Steelers? Obviously a team in transition, and they have to go to a new quarterback. They draft Kenny Pickett, and they have high hopes for him. He had a large body of work at the University of Pittsburgh, right down the street from where Heinz Field is. And basically, they were hoping that sometime during the season he would be in the game unless Mitchell Trubisky was the answer and could hold his own with his new team. Now, at the same time in free agency, they still needed work along the offensive line. This was an offensive line that was put together and blocked so well for Big Ben over the years, but in his last year and a half, with retirements, with free agency and injury, they were down 3 and sometimes 4 offensive linemen for much of Ben's last 2 seasons. So they added 2 more offensive linemen in free agency to try to stabilize that unit. And they really changed the wide receiver room. If you remember, they lost one guy during the season, but they also lost Smith-Schuster to Kansas City. Not Smith-Schuster's fault, but a lot of the other receivers, they led or they were second in the league in NFL in drops, and they really needed to change the room. They added a wide receiver, a strong wide receiver from the University of Georgia. And so the room was changing around. And one of the things that I really thought that they needed to do, and of course, Mike Tomlin addressed that with Trubisky and with the drafting of Kenny Pickett, is that they wanted to diversify the offense. They wanted a little bit more speed at quarterback. Mike Tomlin's always been able to recognize when the league is changing. He switched to more of a press coverage format about 5 or 6 years ago. He amped up the sack pressure when that became one of the stats that was very telling in terms of being correlated with season wins. And now he understands the importance of having a mobile quarterback. It's more of a mobile quarterback league. So those were the things that were going in to the season, the off season, where he wanted to address. So in terms of going beyond the changing of the guard, there's also some schedule notes that I wanted to point out before we get into the season keys. And one of the schedule notes has to deal with the fact that most people who don't just take straight win percentages, but do it based on power ratings like I do, trying to assess schedule difficulty, had Pittsburgh's schedule with 8 home games, 9 road games as either the most difficult or the second most difficult schedule coming into the season. Now, we know that changes based on injuries, other factors that go on. Power ratings change from week to week, but going into the season, it was thought to be a very difficult schedule. But I didn't want to read too much into that because I had these other nuggets. First of all, every Pittsburgh Steelers game was being played on the East Coast. That's 17 time schedules that they're used to. They don't have those 4 West Coast trips that they do every so often. They didn't even have to go to the next area code. So that really helps in terms of continuity and the ease on players' bodies. And because of that, of course, they're traveling the fewest miles of any other team in the NFL. So I took that into consideration as well. The big issue I had with the schedule is not that they had 5 primetime games. A team like Pittsburgh often is scheduled for 5 primetime games because of their draw, because Steeler Nation and so on, because they're always so competitive. But now they were doing it without Big Ben, and they were doing it without one or two other players that had been around for a while. Would a rookie quarterback or would a Mitchell Trubisky be as efficient going from a day game to a night game to a day game as Big Ben was? So that was a little bit more of a worry for me. Now, how to set up a power rating for a particular team. Now, I use a lot of data to go ahead and do this. And with Pittsburgh, it typically is above the average because they've been above average team for year after year after year. If I set my average power rating at about 25, 25 and a half, typically Pittsburgh will open in the 27s or 28s. This year, without Big Ben, with some scheduling issues, with a different roster, with the rise of Baltimore and Cincinnati, I opened them at a 23 power rating, which was really uncharted territory for me. Even then, as we'll see when we get to the schedule, they actually had some value at the beginning of the year, which was quite amazing. But it was a new area for me to put a Pittsburgh power rating below the average team. And it reflects their season win totals, which were, if you use 17 games, an average season win total would be 8.5, and Pittsburgh's was lower than that, I believe mostly around 7.5. So what were my seasonal keys that I put on my team sheets before the season started? The first one is simply this: what happened to the run D? I'm so used to Pittsburgh stuffing the run. It's one of their trademarks, how tough they are at defensive tackle, along the defensive line, at middle linebacker, inside linebacker. But that kind of disappeared last year when they allowed 5.0 yards per carry and 146 yards per game, near or at the bottom of all the NFL. That was a concern for me. That needed to be addressed. My second concern, or my second key, was really, how do they, Big Ben found ways to get the job done. Even though a lot of people criticized him the last year, some rightfully so, he had some arm issues, but it was also, he had to get the ball off much faster in the offense because the offensive line was in such transition. But how do they repeat that 8-2 record in one-score games from 2021? That was probably going to get down unless you had tremendous faith in a rookie quarterback or tremendous faith in Mitchell Trubisky. That was not going to be on my radar screen. Most likely it would regress back toward the median, which would be 5-5, which again meant that they had to be better just to get back to where they wanted to be, was making the playoffs. And the offensive line was still in transition. Now they would have to block for a quarterback that, Big Ben, he could have two people hanging over him and he can still throw a bullet pass. That's not the case with most quarterbacks. They would probably have to hold their blocks a little bit longer now. What about that offensive line? My season win decisions, none were taken. I didn't really get a feel that I thought the line was properly priced. I expected someone still field a very, very strong and stout defense. I expected the run game to do a little bit better. The wide receiver group, the quarterback, that was a problem for me. Maybe coaching would pull them through. Overall, on my sheet, I had them winning 7.5 was the number that I came up with. 8 and 9 was very possible. So I didn't see any value in terms of the season win totals. So how did the season actually play out? Well, first of all, like I said, there was some early value. They caught a Cincinnati team at Cincinnati getting 6.5, 7 points. I took advantage of that. Basically, Cincinnati, as I described when I had Kyle Hunter on, we talked about their offseason. It was a rough offseason for them. They should never have been favored by that many points. But then they turn around. They almost lost that game. They built up a big lead. And then Cincinnati actually had chances to win the game, not cover the spread, but actually to win that particular game. And then they come in and they play a New England team that was more grounded. They had more of their players in place at that particular time. I was able to go against Pittsburgh, against New England, and able to go against Pittsburgh at Cleveland when they were a short underdog as well. I started 3-0. They started 1-4. But one of the reasons why I went against them in weeks 2 and 3 is the unfortunate loss of TJ Watt. 22 and a half sacks, as I said previously in 2021. They would run their record. They would win a game about week 7 or 8 against Tampa Bay, but they would run their record actually to 0-10. You heard me correct. Pittsburgh 0-10 when TJ Watt was not starting in the lineup. And a tremendous record, I think 70% or more when he was in the starting lineup. So a big, big loss. And all of a sudden, they just couldn't pull out games. They were mediocre with Mitch Trubisky. They were getting some things done in the secondary. The run defense was actually playing a little bit better, but they weren't getting to the quarterback. They really missed, obviously, everybody is going to miss, somebody like TJ Watt. And their sacks, they had basically, I'm reading it now, somewhere around, let's see, 1, 2, 3, about a sack a game in the time period that TJ Watt was out of the lineup. That's serious stuff when you're only getting the quarterback once a game with a Pittsburgh team that had 54 sacks a year ago. That means more third down conversions. That means more field goal attempts. They're not kicked out of field goal range. And that had a bearing in some of these close games. So they get TJ Watt back, not 100%, but a devastating loss against a crucial home loss against Cincinnati, drops their record to 3-7. And for all intent and purposes, even though they would scramble to get back into the race, this was now going to be more of a rebuilding year. Let's see what we can do in the last half of the year. Let's turn the reins over to Kenny Pickett and see what he's about. And let's see if if they could finish strong. And with a Mike Tomlin team, they not only finished strong, they finished with a lot of hope at the end of the year. A lot of their rookies, their rookie wide receiver played a big part. Kenny Pickett got his feet wet. He stretched the field a little bit. We saw the run game really change. The run game went 4.4 yards per carry after week 7. So the offensive line was getting a little bit more stability. Remember what happened with Kansas City? I said this with Cincinnati. I'll say this again with Pittsburgh. When you add 2 or more parts to an offensive line, it takes time for chemistry to develop. And in the second half of the season, and specifically in the last 5-6 games of the season, Pittsburgh's chemistry along the offensive line, both in the run game and the pass game, started to click. They had allowed 27 sacks through the first 8 or 9 games. They only allowed another 10 or so the next 6 or 7 games. So things were really starting to click for Pittsburgh. And that's really a good sign for Pittsburgh moving forward. My own personal record was 7-2 against the spread. I was able to recognize when to go against them and when not, when things were gelling with Pittsburgh. So once again, Tomlin finishes with a record over 50%, over 500 percentage. That's every single year in this league. He's done that. The division's not going to get any easier, but Pittsburgh is once again perhaps a team on the rise. What's next for Pittsburgh? I do expect that the offensive line is going to take a little bit more of a baby step. I do expect quarterback play is going to be a little bit better. If they can stay healthy, if they can keep Watt in the lineup, the defense is formidable. The issues I tend to have with them on draft day, their focus is probably one of the top 5 teams in terms of focusing on the draft year in and year out. My problem is their player ratings, with the exception of wide receiver, where they're astonishingly great at finding wide receivers and developing wide receivers. If you take out that component, they tend to draft wide cornerbacks, safeties, offensive linemen that have lower ratings than I would have on my annual draft ratings report. So if they're drafting a cornerback in the 3rd round, typically they may have a 4th or 5th round grade on my board, and they need a little bit more time to develop, or they never develop at all. Remember, Fitzpatrick, who's unbelievable, was not even their draft pick. he was acquired in a trade after only 1 year in the league with the Miami Dolphins. So they didn't draft him. The people that they've been drafting, great focus, but a little bit more time needed to develop. Not the best player ratings. That's my pet peeve, my critique of Pittsburgh in terms of the draft. I'd like to see them get better pass rush depth behind Watt so that maybe they can withstand it when he's missing 1 or 2 or 3 games. Continue to build the offensive line. They must replenish this wide receiver group. It's not a deep group anymore. I trust that they're going to get that job done. Look for them to really target wide receiver on day 2 of the draft, especially. This is a very competitive division. They're going to have to get a little bit better just to make the playoffs, but you never count Pittsburgh out. They need to do a little bit more. My thinking right now is I'm not looking to be fading them necessarily when the season win total comes out, which I expect to be right around 8.5. And I'm not looking to actually go for them because they're going to play 2 games against Joe Burrow and Cincinnati. They're going to be playing 2 games against Baltimore. And those games are always toss-ups. But overall, I didn't think it was that difficult to assess what Pittsburgh was all about. You know what you're getting with a Mike Tomlin team. They play you tough for 60 minutes. They play you hard. And it's just a means of getting the recent draft choices acclimated a little bit more. Pittsburgh's going to be fine. They're probably not going to see a 23 power rating anymore. They closed at about 26, a little bit better than average, a 26 power rating. So I look forward to covering them again. And on a week-to-week basis, I have a lot of data that I use with Pittsburgh because I have a lot of data on how they perform. Stability in the coaching staff gives me a lot of long-term data that I could use and adjust once I see what the metrics are showing after week 4 and during the season. So that's my critique of Pittsburgh. We are finished now with the AFC. I'm saving the 2 Super Bowl teams, Kansas City and Philadelphia, to be the last 2 teams that I do. So up next, later on today, I will be looking at both Dallas and Washington out of the competitive and surprising NFC East. Thank you for watching this. Please like, please subscribe, please tell people about these exit interviews. Later on down the road, we'll have more amazing guests sharing critiques with me, and I will see you with the next 2022 NFL Exit Report.